Welcome to the African News Review podcast, where we cut through the noise and get to the truth. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and each week we are here to challenge the biases, prejudices, and misinformation in the Western press about Africa. Using historical context and contemporary insights, we set the record straight and reclaim the narrative. Tune in every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we uncover the real stories and reshape the conversations about Africa. This is the African News Review podcast, reclaiming Africa's narrative, one story at a time. Greetings, and welcome to another episode of African News Review. Sorry for the slight delay. It was a technical hitch here in the royal capital of London. So, how are you, sir?
Excellent.
Excellent.
Good to see you, comrade.
Yes. Again, I'm your host, Adesoji Iginla, and with me, as usual, is the Comrade Milton Alimadi, host of the at Blackstead News, BAR, author of the book Manufacturing Hate. Get a copy while you can. And most importantly, how are you, sir? How are you again? How are you?
Excellent. Always happy to wake up every day.
Yes, every day is a blessing. And we welcome our guests, those who are joining us for the first time and those who is now part of a staple for them. Do like, share, subscribe, hit the like button, as we would say. And without further ado, let's go for the first story, which comes from BBC and it's about the captain, the good captain, as they will say, Captain Traore. And it reads, why Burkina Faso's junta leader has captured hearts and minds around the world. And there he is. And the lead goes, a charismatic 37-year-old Burkina Faso military captain, ruler Captain Ibrahim Traore, has skillfully built a persona of Pan-African leader determined to free his nation from what is regarded as the clutches of Western imperialism and neocolonialism. Your initial take from that lead alone from the BBC, what would you attribute that kind of headline to?
Well, I attribute it to the facts on the ground, to the mass popular support that this leader is been able to inspire globally, as demonstrated in the protest, digitally and in person. So, even the notorious BBC cannot evade the facts, you see. And obviously, this is something which is not new. Thomas Sankara, excuse me, I'm fighting on cold, inspired the same type of support. But Thomas Sankara, just as Patrice Lumumba before him in Congo, who also inspired the same type of support because they were challenging imperialism. Those two earlier ones did not have the benefit of social media. They operated in the days of BBC, CNN, Washington Post, New York Times. They dominated media. And if we were still operating in that era, Traore would not be getting this coverage right now. You see?
Okay. So I'll dig a little deeper. And so it goes on. It says his message has resonated across Africa and beyond, and with admirers seeing him as following the footsteps of African heroes like Burkina Faso's very own Thomas Sankara, a Marxist revolutionary who is sometimes referred to as Africa's Che Guevara. And it goes on. His message reflects the age we are living in, when many Africans are questioning the relationship with the West, and there is so much poverty in such a rich continent. After seizing power in a coup in 2022, Traore's regime ditched former colonial power France in favor of a strong alliance with Russia. And that has included the deployment of a Russian paramilitary brigade and adopted left-wing economic policies. What can you glean from this paragraph alone? Ditched former colonial powers, now in bed with Russia, has a Russian paramilitary brigade, and adopted left-wing economic policies.
Well, strange as it may sound, it's not actually as hostile as before. And you know what? It's very hard to appear very hostile and negative when you've already acknowledged that somebody's getting so much global support, right? Because now you're left in the situation of, okay, so you're telling us that he's adopting
left-wing
left politics and economics. At the same time, you're admitting that he's getting global support. So are you telling us that left economics and politics is actually very popular globally? You see what they're working with? Think about it. They're in a tight spot.
Boxed into a corner. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll continue. And it says the rule also applied to, okay, so now what we're going to glean into now is what that economic policy entails. This included setting up a state-owned mining company requiring foreign firms to give its, that is the state, a 15% stake in local operations and transfer skills to Burkinabe people. The rule also applied to Russian miner Norgold, who was given a license in late April for its latest investment in Burkina Faso's gold industry. Now, if you don't mind my asking, what is wrong with the state owning a stake in its own resources?
There's absolutely nothing wrong. In fact, he's doing exactly what every African country should have done already and should still do. It's very hard for them. It's going to be hard. And, that's what's been killing us, really. It's been killing us by the fact that in the past, they were the only ones who control narrative. You see?
Yes. And
they dominated media. They told us this is what is good. But now you're telling us that globally people are celebrating a guy who's actually using the country's resources to benefit the country. Where is this world going to end up?
I mean, whatever next.
In other words, they're exposing themselves, right?
Okay. And the article goes further. As part of what Traore calls a revolution to ensure Burkina Faso benefits from its mineral wealth, the junta is also building a gold refinery and establishing national gold reserves for the first time in the nation's history. I repeat that. Establishing national gold reserves for the first time in the nation's history. However, Western-owned firms appear to be facing a tough time with Australian headquartered Barrick Gold Resources launching arbitration proceedings against Burkina Faso in late 2024 following the withdrawal of an exploration license. The junta has...
Right.
Go on.
So, ironically, a mere few months ago, that would be the headline of this story.
In fact, it was.
And that would be the lead of this story.
In fact, it was. If you remember the article we dealt with
Absolutely.
in the Financial Times.
You see how things have changed so quickly? Now this is buried somewhere deep in the story. It's not blaring now. Western firms under attack in Burkina Faso by leftist regime. So that headline is now parked somewhere.
The keyword being parked.
I'm not willing to sing praises to the BBC. And I'll tell you why. Because that headline, Western firms under attack, and I'm not saying there is a headline like that already, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's one already written and packed somewhere, waiting to be used on the occasion they think it's time to use it. You see? So they go like this.
The swinging pendulum. Yeah.
They have no principles. There's no moral compass. Right now, clearly, it is not the time to be going too aggressively against somebody you've already acknowledged is getting worldwide support. You see?
True.
But at the same time, you cannot fully embrace him, of course.
Because to do so,
So those of us who read the BBC very closely are the ones who are able to analyze and say, compared to previous articles, they're actually praising him in this article.
okay. Then it goes further. It says Eric Randley Atkins, a researcher at South Africa's Institute for Security Studies and the BBC, said Traore's radical reforms have increased his popularity in Africa. He is now arguably Africa's most popular, if not favorite president. And then he goes into why. Mr. Ocheng said Traore first caught the attention of Africans when he spoke at the Russian African Summit in 2023, telling African leaders to stop behaving like puppets who dance every time the imperialists pull the string. The speech was heavily publicized by Russian media, which has become a major player in promoting Traore's Pan-Africanist image. Traore attracted commemorations in Russia last week to mark the 80th anniversary of the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. He posted on X, him and military leaders from neighboring Mali and Niger were inspired by it to winning its war against terrorism and imperialism at all costs. Thanks to the rhetoric pulled by a slick social media campaign, his appeal has spread across the world, including among African Americans and Black Britons, Ms. Ocheng said. Everyone who has experienced racism, colonialism, and slavery can relate to his message, Ms. Ocheng said, pointing out that African Americans rapper Meek Mill had posted about him on X last year, saying he much liked his energy and heart. And though he was ridiculed for mixing up the names by referring to Traore as Burkina Faso, but later deleted the post. But here's the pushback. But France president is not a fan, describing Traore as part of a baroque alliance between self-proclaimed Pan-Africans and neo-imperialists. What does he mean by that?
I have no idea. And who cares about what the French president, thinks? But there are a few interesting points that you read.
Okay.
So first of all, I like what Ms. Ocheng is saying, but she should not be afraid to speak her mind. So when you say he's the most popular, if not most favorite,
If not,
what does that mean? What are you saying? How do you define favorite? Favorite to whom? You see? Why can he not be both the most popular and the favorite? So I think that was an unnecessary concession to the BBC, right?
Okay.
Is that the price of being quoted and making sure that they call me again in the future? So that was, gratuitous. There was no need for that. Most popular, not favorite. I mean, we are here to analyze, right?
Yes.
So that's one of the things I picked up.
Okay.
And then on the part of the BBC, that Russian media is also a main promoter. So what is wrong with that, right? If Russian media is a main promoter of Traore, given the relationship they now have, but they make it appear as if that's something so sinister, you know. Unless it's being promoted by the BBC, anything else should be regarded as something sinister. And then I also like the fact that the article acknowledged something we mentioned from the get-go, the power of social
media.
If social media existed, Lumumba never would have been killed. He would have been able to govern. You see? Lumumba, in fact, the news about his murder, I think, was not available internationally until several days later. Now, things like this we would see in real time, you see? And this is very important in terms of checking the aggressive and brutal nature of imperialism, right? And it's reflected in the tone of this BBC article. It's not fully endorsing the guy, but it's not hostile and critical as the many previous articles, because it's acknowledging the fact that there seems to be a lot of global popular support to what Traore is doing in Burkina Faso. And of course, how do we know that? Not because of the BBC or the New York Times or CNN. We know that because the information is now widely disseminated on social media. You see? If they still had the monopoly that they had in the era of Sankara or the era of Patrice Lumumba, we have no knowledge. First of all, it would be difficult to generate the type of global outpouring of support. You see?
Correct.
Yeah, so those are the points I wanted to make. But the French president is saying something predictable. It's not even interesting. You're only interesting if you're about to acknowledge the reality on the ground, that Africa has changed. You cannot impose your imperialism anymore. You threatened Niger after the coup. You said the coup should be reversed in 2 weeks. You, France, you were speaking through ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. 2 years later, that regime is still in place. That government is in place in Niger. So if Macron cannot take that as the evidence and proof that France is irrelevant, then I don't know any better example that I can give him.
Just taking a quick break here on the African News Review podcast, but don't go anywhere. If you're enjoying our deep dive into the real stories behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern, we're here to debunk the myths and bring you the truth about Africa. Want to help spread the word? Share this podcast with your friends and leave us a review. It goes a long way in helping others discover the real Africa. Without further ado, let's get back to setting the record straight. Okay, one last part from the article, and it goes to a story we dealt with last week. It's here. It's here. In a statement, okay, so to set the tone for it, it's about the economy of Burkina Faso. In a statement in early April, the IMF said, despite a challenging humanitarian and security environment, the economy was expected to remain robust in 2025, and the regime has made commendable progress in raising domestic revenue, turning the public wage bill, and increasing spending on education, health, and social protection. As for the World Bank, said inflation has surged from 0.7% in 2023 to 4.2% in 2024. But the extreme poverty rate, which refers to people living on less than $2.15 a day, has fallen by almost 2% to 24% because of robust growth in the agricultural and service sector. Why is that important? Despite this report, US-based financial institutions relations with both France and America has been frosty. A recent example of that was the head of the U.S. African Command, General Michael Langley, said Traore was using Burkina Faso's gold reserve for his junta's protection rather than the nation's benefit. So who do we believe? The World Bank, the IMF, or the good old general?
Well, the general has already been widely abused globally, that I don't want to heap any more abuse upon him. I think he has gotten enough attacks. But what I find very interesting is that the BBC actually has a balanced article on Burkina Faso. You see, from the BBC to go out of its way to introduce the perspective of the IMF and the World Bank, that is in itself remarkable. You know, because these are the establishment financial organizations that are in fact whose role is to enforce neocolonialism and dependency in Africa. The BBC goes and says, even these guys who are generally hostile to left politics and economics are giving this guy the thumbs up. And they place that ahead of General Langley before they introduce what he said. That is very significant for the BBC, for those of us that follow and read the BBC very closely. So this is a very significant concession. Overall, a very positive article about Burkina Faso and Traore by the BBC when compared to all previous articles on the same topic and same individual by the BBC. So I have to acknowledge that.
Would that be safe to assume now that you can recommend the BBC as a go-to?
No way. I'm waiting for them to give me another opportunity to start attacking them on random.
Okay, so for the next story, we stay in the UK, we go to The Guardian. And this time it's Mr. Trump. And it reads, first group of white South Africans arrive in US after Trump grants refugee status. Trump has stirred controversy by calling Afrikaners, minority descended from Dutch colonists, victims of a genocide, in inverted commas. And there's a picture. The first group of white South Africans granted refugee status by Donald Trump administration has arrived in the United States, stirring controversies in South Africa as the US president declared Afrikaners victims of a genocide. I don't know. Do you have first thoughts on that, Elon? That is just...
No, these are the descendants of genocidaires in South Africa. These are the descendants of Europeans whose hands were dripping with the bloods of Africans when they were buried. Their forefathers and foremothers, their ancestors.
Okay.
Yeah, they were quite brutal killers. They displaced Africans from their land. They killed Africans. They took over their land. And now a fellow European who happens to be governing the United States is trying to whitewash history. But the facts are the facts.
Okay. So glad you've cleared that up. So first things first, it says the Afrikaners, this is the Guardian doing, it's putting things into proper context. A minority descended from mainly Dutch colonists were met at Dulles International Airport, Washington, D.C. by U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Ludde and Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security Tony Edgar, with many giving U.S. flags to wave. Very propaganda. At the Dulles Airport, Ludde told the assembled white South Africans, "It is such an honor for us to receive you here today. It makes us happy to see you with our flag in your hands." He invoked his family's history, saying, "My own father had been in Europe and had to leave his country when Hitler came in. We respect what you've had to deal with for this last few years," he added. we are sending a clear message that the United States would reject the egregious persecution of people in the hands on the basis of race in South Africa. What?
So what is his name again? The guy who was quoted?
Christopher London.
You know, ignorance is not bliss. People that say that, I disagree. This guy is an ignoramus of the highest order. He says his family fled. Well, first of all, he's welcoming them in the sense that welcoming fellow Europeans. So that is not surprising.
Okay.
You know, because the Europeans in the United States exterminated the indigenous population, sometimes called Native Americans, you know. So that in itself is not surprising. But his level of ignorance is just appalling. And that comes when you have this, you pack government just based on race, without qualification. So the people Trump packed in government are packed in government because they're fellow Europeans. Totally ignorant, you know? This is what you call affirmative action. In this case, affirmative action of the highest order. Afrikaners wanted to fight on Hitler's side.
No, please.
Afrikaners would have killed your parents, you fool. Afrikaners wanted to fight on Hitler's side on World War II.
Thank you very much.
So this ignoramus is saying, welcome, I also fled from Europe. So I actually like this. I'm saying bring all of them here so that our sisters and brothers can inherit the land in South Africa.
Of course. And then he goes on. He says, Trump suspended the U.S. settlement program in January, in more than 100,000 approved for refugees resettlements stranded. Then in February, he signed an executive order directing officials to grant refugee status to Afrikaners whose leaders ruled during apartheid while violently repressing the black majority. It is genocide.
Yeah, I mean, the Guardian could do and should do much better than that in future. They did not suppress the black majority. They committed genocide. In South Africa. So just flip it around and tell readers the truth, that these are not victims of genocide. These are the descendants of the people that committed genocide against Africans in South Africa. But be that as it may, let's continue.
Okay. So, and it says, this is Trump now talking. It is a genocide that's taking place, Trump told reporters at White House when asked why South Africans were getting prioritized for resettlement above victims of famine and
war elsewhere. But the reporters are also incompetent. Why did they not then ask him, oh, Mr. President, how many of these whites have been killed? Boom. I wonder what he would have said. Well, I don't have that information. Oh, if you don't, then why are you calling it genocide? End of story, right there. You see? Sometimes you have these incompetent reporters as well who don't know when to seize opportunity. It's just mind-boggling.
Yes. Okay.
Nobody has asked him. I hope somebody asked him at some point.
No, I don't think they did.
How many people have killed?
There's no.
Do you have a figure of the number killed by this genocide and by whom? How long is this genocide? Was it comparable? Is it similar to what happened in Rwanda when 100,000 people were killed over a period of about 100 days? Was it similar to that? Is that how it happened, Mr. President? Expose his total ignorance and expose the fact that this is stuff being fed to him by Elon Musk. You can do it by asking questions. That's why you have the privilege of being a journalist and access to a person who is as powerful as this person, President of the United States. Ask him questions.
Yeah, but we have to be mindful that
unbelievable.
These reporters work for a corporate organization
then don't bother writing the story at all, because we're going to tear you down on Adesogi Speaks.
So what you're saying is this journalist was doing performative journalism, just being there.
No, but you know what? I think sooner or later somebody's going to ask him. And then sooner or later, these Europeans, and which is very sad, I want them to stay here because sooner or later people are going to start chasing them back to South Africa. I don't want them to go back there. I let them stay here. Because first of all, here, they're going to find millions of Europeans who are suffering in these economic conditions when all the wealth is being transferred to the very wealthy Europeans. The majority of impoverished people are, in fact, Europeans as well in this country, you see? Because capitalism at some point really does not care
What you look like.
whether those on the low level, the victims are Europeans or not. People keep forgetting the first exploited labor that colonialist Europeans used in the Caribbean and in what is now the United States were fellow white people. People they emptied prisons from England, and they called them indentured laborers. They kidnapped Europeans from the streets of London and brought them to work here as indentured labor, right? Because the indigenous populations that exterminated them with diseases, they were not functioning well in these conditions of labor, so they exploited fellow Europeans. It was only much later the third group of people exploited were African enslaved Africans, right? So the point is, if they're willing to do that to fellow Europeans at that time, they do it again today, right? So these Europeans fleeing South Africa are going to find fellow Europeans struggling in this country, and they'll say, wait a minute. South Africa, every European, even the most unqualified, which are the people coming here right now? The qualified European with assets in South Africa would not be running away, right? They'll find out that fellow Europeans are suffering this country, whereas in South Africa, every European, by virtue of just being white, is privileged. They will start running back to South Africa. And I hope Cyril Ramaphosa revokes their passport and citizenship and does not allow them to return. That's what I'm saying.
There was political.
Number two, let me tell you the true reason why I like this story and why I like what Trump is doing, right?
Exposing.
And I hope it brings more and more Europeans here. Not only because it creates opportunities for Africans, but this is the main reason why I like it.
Yep.
The African National Congress is floundering. Economic freedom fighters are struggling in terms of messaging. There can be no better messaging that imperialism is so much against us to the extent that they're willing to call descendants of genocidaires as victims of genocide and carry them and take them all the way to America. So we really have to fight for ourselves as Africans. So now Trump is giving them new messaging and new validation, you see, if they know how to craft this message properly, so that by the time of the next election, they're not performing the way they performed in the last election. You see, Trump is giving them meat to chew on. So I'm saying eat the meat properly.
And if you can, chew on the bone as well.
Take advantage.
So yes, that said, I have new so-called victims. I mean, the system constantly plays themselves as victims, which takes us to the real story of victims. Next, from France 24. And it reads, 4 decades on, still no justice for South African apartheid era atrocities. Victims of apartheid atrocities are suing the South African government for damages over failing to prosecute those suspected of committing apartheid-era crimes. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission put forward 300 suspects to be investigated for possible prosecution. The vast majority were never pursued. And it goes on. On June 27, 1985, Latta and his colleagues Matthew Gerlach, Sparrow, Morato, and Sikato Misuli drove to Port Elizabeth for a United Democratic Front meeting, but they never returned. Their desecrated corpses were found burnt with signs of torture, and they would become known as the Cradock Four. They have pulled my father's tongue out of his mouth, Kalata said, and they also cut off his ring finger. I don't know why, she said. What do you think, in light of the story we just read about so-called victims, is the reason why these crimes have not been prosecuted? Almost 34 years, going on 34 years now.
Because we have a neocolonial government in South Africa. You know, we have a government that is not willing. We have opened this discussion today by discussing what's going on in Burkina Faso and Traore. In South Africa, we have the opposite, right? There's a half-hearted attempt to address the legacies of apartheid. And the longer it takes, the more difficult it becomes to address these legacies. At the end of apartheid, right, you have the raw memory of the brutality of apartheid, which is fresh on the mind of the victims and the perpetrators, right? And the global audience that has been witnessing apartheid in South Africa and the transformation of apartheid in South Africa. So you had stronger justification to take much more decisive actions at that time. You see, it's more like very similar to that argument of African unity that Nkrumah made. He said, you know what, with time, it's going to become much more difficult. So that's why we have to do it immediately. Let's come together, let our foreign ministers draft the articles of unity, and we just sign it, and we form a continental government. Even Nyerere, who opposed that approach, later on said Nkrumah was correct. He said, as these presidents became used to having their sovereign entities, they became used to their national anthem, became used to their national. I'm wondering, did I lose you for a second?
I think, yeah, there was a cutoff. Go on, but continue. We're back.
Okay, so now you have a government that has not been able to tackle many of these legacies of apartheid South Africa. We're talking more than 30 years later. So how is it going to become easier? Now, the importance of messaging, of course, becomes very important. And that's why I go back to what I said earlier regarding this Trump agenda to bring the descendants of genocideers and call them victims to the United States.
Yeah.
Those are the kind of opportunities that you can use to make the argument. That's why this is precisely why we need decisive action to redress the legacies of apartheid. But you have the current president, Ramaphosa, a full-fledged capitalist, right? Who is a billionaire in US dollars, not just South African rand, right?
Correct.
So he's a very big accommodationist to global multinational penetration in South Africa. And there's no magic behind it to lift up the people that are really at the bottom. There has to be income redistribution. And if capitalist Europeans are drawing the line and they're saying, no way, you have a problem. You have a problem. Where's your momentum, right?
Yeah.
That you're going to use to say this is why we need decisive action. And you had it in 1990 at the conclusion, the formal conclusion of apartheid. So you need to find a way to generate that momentum again. And I don't see it happening under a billionaire president in South Africa, whether he's African
Or not.
or not.
Okay.
You see, as Steve Biko correctly predicted. Anybody who has not watched that interview, go on YouTube and search for Steve Biko, Biko, interview. Interview is 27 minutes, and the most important part comes to the end when he says, if we think changing apartheid is just replacing the white leaders with black leaders, we are going to be gravely mistaken. It would have been as if nothing changed.
Did you say black looters?
You know, the guy was prescient because he was speaking truth to power.
Yeah.
You see?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll continue. There's a part here I want us to have a look at. Vikoli, a former head of the National Prosecuting Authority, testified in 2015 that there were political interference by the government of Thabo Mbeki. Vikoli said the fear that members of the Mbeki's African National Congress were at risk of prosecution led the government not to pursue in all relevant investigations. Could that be the reason why we've not had the...
That was part of it.
Okay.
That was not all of it. The biggest part was the economic aspect. But yes, it's true what you just read, because
So the economic interest of the players played a key role. Correct. In... Okay.
It played the essential role. But what you just read also played a role in the sense that if you're going to prosecute the killers of people like Kalato, if you're going to prosecute the killers of people like Biko, you created this court and you said, quote unquote, both sides should come and confess to crimes. And then you have your own ANC members who said, oh, in the way, although I personally don't think these should be equalized and put on the same plane.
Mm-hmm.
So you have ANC members who say in the course of fighting this racist apartheid system, you know, we also did this and that and that. So now if you prosecute the killers of Biko, why will you not prosecute the ANC members who also admitted that they did this and that and that? So I think that's what the article is saying, that the ANC did not want to expose itself also to prosecution. You see?
Okay. I think
it's like,
go on.
Another example is like the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, right?
Yeah.
Which the British demonized as the Mau Mau, right?
Correct.
So they attacked European civilians during the struggle, right? So now at the end, let's say they had a similar reconciliation commission. Are you going to be subject to the Europeans who killed Africans and took over their land, right?
Okay.
And then turned them into exploited wage labor on land that used to belong to them? Are you going to put them on the same plane with the resistance fighters? I find that very difficult to follow, you see. In many liberation struggles, that's not, the way it's been done. The way it's been done at the end of the liberation struggle, obviously, not all crimes are the same.
Definitely not.
Right?
Definitely not.
But in the case of South Africa, I don't see how you pardon the people who killed Steve Biko, to be honest with you. You see? I've always had a problem with that. Reconciliation is very desirable, but some crimes are beyond the pale. I think that article is saying, not saying it the way I'm saying it, but they're saying the ANC did not want to be, prosecuted, of course. But you only get to that position because you put everybody in the same
position.
table. which I don't think was
a
100%
fair
correct.
assessment.
Mhm.
Okay. I'm having some technical issues here. I think we'll have to resume next week. And again, I have to thank you for coming through. For some reason, I don't know why my camera has frozen on me, and which is quite.
I can hear you though.
Yeah, I know you can, but I mean, I can run the last story because we.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So if you don't mind, I'll run the last story. Hopefully, you can see my screen. Stop sharing this. And the last story comes from Radio Deutsche Welle, the German uh, website, and it's about South Africa. It's talking about going back to the issue of equity. Apparently, the story reads: South African Democratic Alliance fights new equity law. South Africa amended Europe Employment Equity Act has sparked the heated debate. Supporters see it as essential for social transformation, while the Democratic Alliance say it is unconstitutional and economically harmful. I know you know where this story is going, but I'll read on. It reads: South African Democratic Alliance (DA), the second biggest political party in government, went to court last week to challenge new employment equity laws that impose strict hiring targets for non-white employers. The Employment Equity Amendment Act updates a 1998 law requiring employers to set and report on diversity targets, and it aims to boost the hiring of Black people and other groups to some industries. Statistics cited by Reuters news agency shows that South Africa's companies are still dominated by white people at the top, with Black employees mainly occupying lower level roles. Unemployment is much higher amongst Black citizens. Your thoughts?
Well, this is what we've been discussing. The whites don't want to yield wealth. They've drawn the line on the sand. So what we have are two narratives in Africa right now. We have in West Africa, in Burkina Faso, in Mali and Niger, you have the leadership transferring wealth from domination by foreign multinational corporations to the African population. That's the narrative in West Africa, particularly in these three countries. In South Africa, we have the exact opposite. We have the multinationals, because the economy is controlled and dominated by the multinationals, with their European representatives who are citizens of South Africa, drawing the line on the soil and saying, no, there should be no wealth redistribution. I don't think that's a tenable argument, really. It is not, And I'm very surprised. They showed to me a level of unintelligence, which is quite remarkable.
So, for me,
a European party could not sit down and say this, given the economic conditions prevailing, including unemployment of Africans or Black people, 4 times more than unemployment of Europeans. Given the
demographic
brutality, the historical legacy, which was very brutal, given the dispossession, which has not yet been addressed, since we Europeans, 8% still control 72%. Should we not, Europeans, come out with a proposal to address these legacies so that we can have a prosperous, harmonious society? Think about that. But they're incapable of doing that. Instead, they're arguing the opposite.
Correct. So that
there should be less diversity on the jobs. There should be less diversity in opportunities. There should be no land reform. It is appalling and very dangerous, by the way. Very dangerous. Because in the long run, you may find Africans that are less accommodating than the Africans that are on the scene today, you know?
Which is what they don't.
And you're the one that is actually creating that environment.
Correct.
You see?
Which is what they refuse to concede to. And
Mhm.
in fact, much more, double down. There is a,
Double down.
yeah,
And it's very deep seated.
yeah,
It shows that even all these years, even with the entire history of apartheid,
mhm,
you do not see Africans as fellow human beings.
correct. There is a part here.
Otherwise, nobody should be prompting you to make this kind of proposal that I'm suggesting right now.
I mean, these are not even concessions. These are, like you said, these are proposals that if you want to engage in the society with, based on some sort of equity, you would embrace these reforms wholeheartedly without even being imposed upon. But
Right.
there is a part.
Unless you see yourself
Mhm.
as a community of European privilege existing in Africa, but not really of Africa, which is actually, historically, which is exactly what it is,
Mm. And he goes further. And one last part. Debating fairness and power. The pro-business, that's the part you don't like. The pro-business DAs.
I'm going to actually write to them to stop that nonsense, Stop telling us it's pro-business, but tell us it is the white-controlled party.
Yes.
That puts it in much more better context.
Yeah. The pro-business DA said the act violates anti-discrimination clauses can you imagine, in South Africa's constitution and gives the state too much regulatory power. Helen Zille, chair of the DA Federal Council, said the new law will drive unemployment up, economic growth down, and make far more people marginalized in our economy than currently are. She added, the legislation is unfair and gives totalitarian power of social engineering to the country's labor minister. I don't even know what to say.
These are very repulsive statements.
I don't even know what to say.
Social engineering was conducted by the architects of apartheid. So now the victims, you accuse them of social engineering.
Can you imagine?
It's the level. It's very disgusting, quite frankly.
I mean, when we were dealing with the story.
But it just confirms what I just said a minute ago.
Yep.
It is greed of the ultimate order.
I mean, when we're talking about the story.
To them, only Europeans are entitled to the good life.
Wow.
To live the life of comfort, to have decent education, decent homes, decent food, enjoy entertainment, enjoy healthcare, What can I say? I mean, they expose themselves with their own words,
True.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's, when she said it will drive economic unemployment up, it's already up. Which means you are creating I don't even know what kind of narrative we can call that. If we can call it a narrative at all, other than just saying something to say something.
Yeah, I don't think we should give her too much attention. Okay. It's just a European protecting European privilege.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you notice, and I will invite listeners.
Yep.
That they should go back and look at some of the articles we've analyzed. And once they like some suspects, they keep calling and quoting the usual suspects again and again. Which, of course, also is a revelation that these publications also have their own agenda, which, of course, there's no secret about it. That's what we discuss every week.
Yeah. Because, I mean, basically parroting the interest of the host nations. In the case of
Correct.
this is a German publication, which it's Dutch, quasi-Dutch affiliation. So you can only guess who they would go to, and then trumpet whatever that person says without, I mean, sometimes what sends me up the wall is when these journalists go out and pen stories like this, do they read it back to themselves?
No, but it's our job to also check them. And we have evidence that it's worked many times. And to be frank, it's not only the journalists, it's the people that produce the editors, the producers. They check the tone. After a while, journalists know which kinds of stories are not going to get wide play.
Yeah.
And of course, every journalist wants her or his story to be widely disseminated. So sometimes when they see producers, editors suppressing certain types of stories, they start conforming and become conformist as well. Not all journalists, of course. There are a few who are exceptional and say, I don't want to be a part of this, But many are dependent on their jobs for their paycheck, right?
True.
So that's an issue in itself as well.
True. Anyway, we leave to continue next week. Again, thank our listeners and viewers for tuning in. Technical hitch on my end. My camera has decided to rest on me. But again, kudos to the good comrade, always coming through with the analysis, spot on. And again, what we do without you. Hopefully, your cold, you recover fully from your cold. And
yes, sir.
Yes, you were talking about books earlier. Yes, I would love to come to New York to get some books, but apparently, if we do say that at the port of entry, Mr. Trump is going to turn us back.
Come after the midterm elections, I think things are going to change decisively.
Okay.
And the tone will become very different. So it's not too far. It's not too far from that.
Because I do miss my books. And yeah. So yeah. Okay. Again, your last words?
Aluta continua, sisters and brothers. See you next week.
And from me, it's also see you next week, and hopefully be able to wave to you. And thank you all for coming through. Speak to you next week. That's a wrap for this week on the African News Review podcast. We hope you are leaving with a clearer, more truthful picture of Africa. Remember, every story has another side, and we're here to uncover it. Don't forget to join us next Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we continue to challenge the narratives and reclaim Africa's voice. If you've enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeing Africa for what it truly is.